Before the first hint of dawn, a lone sentry crouched behind the shrug of concrete and iron that jutted from the shoreline. Salt stung his face. The channel was a low grey smear at the horizon. He had watched that horizon for months, patrols, trawlers, the odd exercise, but tonight it seemed ordinary. He keyed his binoculars, listening for the small, telltale sounds, the slap of waves, the distant thump of a fishing engine. Then the sound arrived, not a ripple but a slow, rising roar that swallowed everything else. At first he thought it was aircraft. It wasn't. The noise became a tide of metal and steam, a far-off engine room that grew, and with the first light there were ships where there should have been only sea. Landing craft crowded the water, troops descended like tidewater streaming ashore. German generals, who had planned for a raid, suddenly faced something else entirely. An invasion force so vast and unexpected that their eyes could hardly reconcile it with the maps on the table back at headquarters. For many of them, the morning brought a discovery that felt unbelievable. Tens of thousands of Allied soldiers on their beaches, in some reports a staggering 156,000 men pouring into France before the day was done. This scene, one bunker, one man, one horizon, shrinks and expands. It becomes the whole of June 6th, a coastline that had been fortified with concrete and wire, defended on paper but fragile in practice, commanders arguing behind closed doors, secret agents whispering false plans, forecasters watching weather charts like priests reading omens, and pilots, paratroopers, and seamen poised to turn a single sliver of time into decisive action. That low building roar at dawn was the sound of a chosen moment arriving. It was the sound of strategy meeting opportunity. If this story is pulling you in, subscribe for the full hour-by-hour account and stay with the narrative. There are hours of decisions and missteps that follow the first light. The months before that morning are an essential part of the picture. The Atlantic Wall looked imposing on paper. Batteries, bunkers, obstacles dug into the sand, and entire regiments assigned to hold a coastline. But the real picture at the tactical level was different. Defenders were scattered along hundreds of miles, units of uneven quality, seasoned troops here, improvised conscripts there. Equipment was not uniformly available. In many places, the concrete fortifications were grand facades masking thin garrisons. German commanders could cite maps and unit names and divisions, but the maps could not conjure more men or more fuel. At the operational center, the debate over how best to use the armored reserve, panzer divisions, split opinion into two camps. One argued that the panzers should be stationed close to the coast, ready to slam down onto invaders as soon as they touched sand. The other, more cautious line of thought, insisted that tanks must be held centrally, part of a powerful reserve meant to be unleashed only after a confirmed, sustained landing had been identified. Each approach had logic. Deploy armor to the coast, and you could meet an assault immediately. Keep it centralized and you preserve a strategic punch, avoiding being lured by feints. For German commanders, choosing between immediate local reaction and centralized control was more than a tactical preference. It was a decision about how to survive surprise. Into that argument walked deception. The Allies had invested heavily in a campaign to mislead, codenamed Operation Fortitude. False radio traffic, feeding apparent plans to invade elsewhere, shadow armies invented on paper and echoed by controlled leaks and dummy equipment. These were the instruments of fortitude. The most successful single human agent in that campaign was Juan Pujol Garcia, whom the Germans would come to know as Garbo. He fed a web of false reports to German intelligence, convincing them that the main invasion might come at a different point on the coast. Garbo's work injected doubt. It was not only the content of the deception, but its persistence. The more convincing the phantom orders and the more consistent the misdirection, the harder it became for German staffs to treat Normandy as the obvious focus. Deception did not create panic, but it sharpened anxieties and lent credibility to the idea that any apparent beach landing could be a ruse. Allied meteorologists added another layer to this gamble. In the days leading up to the chosen date, the weather over the channel had conspired against the planners. Storms rolled across the water, and the forecast looked bleak for an amphibious assault. Meteorological work in that era was an art mingled with limited science. The lives of thousands would hinge on whether a weather window existed at all. Group Captain James Stagg and his team analyzed barometer readings, wind forecasts, and the temperamental behavior of storms. They found what seemed to be a narrow opening, a temporary lull between two systems that would give enough wind reduction and sea calm for airborne operations and landing craft to cross. It was a risky call because the window was short and fragile, yet risk was baked into the plan. The Allies had already committed immense forces and coordination. When General Eisenhower weighed the options, he chose to use the window, aware that a miscalculation could be catastrophic, but that delay would mean losing strategic surprise. The night that preceded the landings was its own kind of violence. Paratroopers and glider troops slipped out over Normandy and points inland in darkness, landing in fields, tree lines, and small villages. Their drop zones were scattered across dozens of miles. Their mission was to cut lines of communication, seize key bridges, and sow confusion behind the coastal defenses. Phone lines, literal lines of command, were culled and snapped. Pickets were overwhelmed. In the fog of early morning, reports arriving at German staff rooms were patchy, contradictory, and many were dismissed as the usual wartime flurry. But the pattern was more than random noise. It was the setup to the beach landings to follow. At sea, the armada that had gathered under masking radio silence and blackout drew near. Landing craft, some packed to capacity, rode the channel in formations that bent their impressive numbers into a living spearhead. The beaches themselves presented a spectrum of resistance. On some sectors, men found lighter opposition and made progress. On others, the cost was immediate and terrible. Omaha, in particular, saw catastrophic casualties as soldiers encountered concentrated fire from high ground and tangled obstacles that shredded landing craft and pinned men in the surf. Elsewhere, beaches that had been prepared with careful intelligence and planning saw troops establish footholds with fewer losses. Those contrasts would, in time, be smoothed into a single operational success, but in the hours and days that followed, the disparity in experience was stark. Back in German command centers, the debate over panzer deployment intensified as reports filtered in. Some commanders, among them Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, urged rapid movement of armored forces to the coast, convinced that immediate counterattack was the only way to plug the breach before it could be exploited. Others, like Gerd von Rundstedt, argued in favor of maintaining the panzers as a central reserve. They feared the possibility of being tricked into sending finite armored strength into killing zones or into engaging before the main thrust's strength could be confirmed. These were not simply abstract positions. They reflected contradictory fears: fear of acting too soon and fear of missing the moment to act at all. The German High Command's decision-making process was further complicated by the requirement that certain movements, especially of strategic armored reserves, receive personal authorization from Hitler or the Supreme Command, the OKW. That mechanism of control created time as a weapon that could be wielded by the Allies without firing a shot. Time, in military terms, is counted in narrow margins. On D-Day, the margin that mattered most was the hours between first light and the arrival of effective Allied air power over roads and causeways. For some hours after the first landings, crucial armored formations remained in place, unable to move until permission to commit them was granted from Berlin. Those hours would prove decisive. When orders did begin to flow, the world had shifted. Allied air superiority, concentrated and relentless, meant that daylight movement, especially mechanical movement on predictable routes, was brutally exposed. Fighter bombers and medium bombers prowled the roads, turning columns of tanks and trucks into flailing targets. The once hopeful highways out of the German rear became killing fields. Burning hulks and shattered materiel clogged routes. Armored formations, intended to close quickly with the invaders, found their mobility evaporating under strafing and bombing. The Germans' fear of losing tanks in piecemeal engagements was realized not at the hands of other armored units, but by the concentrated application of air power that had transformed the ground into a theater where movement itself might spell destruction. Amid this strategic swirl, an attempt stood out: the 21st Panzer Division's counterattack. Led in the field by Colonel Hermann von Oppel-Bronickowski, the 21st moved with purpose once it was finally permitted to advance. It managed to cut through traffic and make a drive toward the coast that for a time threatened to split the Allied lodgment. The sight of armored columns closing toward the beaches alarmed commanders and men ashore. For some moments it seemed as if the German tanks might succeed in rolling the tide back, that a single, concentrated armored thrust could sever the foothold and reassert control. But the counterattack met several problems. Roads clogged with retreating units and destroyed vehicles slowed the advance. Allied air attacks harassed and broke up formations, and paratroopers and glider-borne reinforcements found ways to delay flankers and harass supply elements. The 21st came close. It was within sight of the sea, a heart-stopping moment for both sides, and then it faltered and broke. Engines died, tracks were abandoned, men were captured or scattered. The near success dissolved into frustrated, bitter withdrawal. Within the German staff, the scene was one of cumulative paralysis. Messages arrived at irregular intervals and were cross-checked, argued over, and sometimes delayed. Requests for clarity fed back into the machine and became tangled in protocol. Commanders who had perceived the invasion's gravity early found their urgings caught in the bureaucracy. General Erich Marx, for instance, pressed for action and recognized the peril. But the intricate web of authorization and the misplaced confidence in a more centralized doctrine meant his warnings arrived in a system ill-suited to rapid remedy. By the time broader action could be taken, air interdiction had already exacted a ruinous toll. The cost of that delay, both in material and in human life, was severe. Tanks, armored cars, and supply lorries became stationary targets as daylight made them vulnerable. Bridges and junctions, once instrumental for swift armored movement, were neutralized. The tactical consequence was immediate. The German ability to deliver a concentrated armored punch at the beachhead was effectively neutralized. Strategically, the longer-term effect was decisive. Even a small foothold that survives the early desperate hours can be sufficient for the attackers to pour in men, engineers, supplies and armor in succession. Logistical superiority, sea control and air cover make a beachhead a funnel through which growing power flows. By nightfall on June 6th, the Allies had anchored themselves to the French coast. Contemporary records vary. Some accounts count approximately 133,000 Allied troops ashore by nightfall. Other reports put the number higher, approaching the stark figure of 156,000 that shocked many German commanders. Whatever the precise count, the discovery that morning of such vast numbers on the beaches was a psychological blow that crystallized the operational reality. The lodgment had been established, and the chance to sweep it away had largely passed. The role of deception cannot be overstated in how that shock was experienced. Fortitude had not simply created a diversion, it had reframed how German leaders assessed incoming intelligence. When messages and rumblings suggested activity, the existence of a plausible false invasion elsewhere encouraged caution. If commanders feared that every contact might be an elaborate feint, they were less likely to commit their most valuable assets immediately. This mix of plausible denial and bureaucratic requirement for high-level approval produced a lethal timidity. In the calculus of war, misjudging the enemy's intent can be as fatal as being outgunned. Consider a single highway running inland from one of the beaches. In the early hours it was sighted by Allied reconnaissance aircraft, which then directed strikes that turned the road into a mesh of burned vehicles and cratered earth. A panzer column, even if ordered forward, would find itself halted by the damage and the smoke. Pumping men and material forward by sea was a continuous process that night. Landing craft came in waves. Engineers worked under fire to clear obstacles and build rudimentary exits. The tide of men and stores that accumulated by dawn and then by nightfall could not be simply erased. The loss of mobility on the ground for the defenders compounded the effect. Not only could they not rapidly form a counterblow, but their capacity to move reserves to threatened sectors was sharply degraded. Air power thus turned time and terrain into allies of the invader. The human side of that calculus is stark. Men who had watched the Channel for years, who had trained and plotted, found themselves confronting an unfolding truth they hadn't fully anticipated. Some officers had been right about the threat. Some had been right about the need to move quickly. Some had been wrong. The war's ironies stack in these moments. A commander who had argued for immediate deployment of armor may have been overruled by doctrine or by the caution of others. When his warnings proved prescient, the reprieve he sought came too late. General Wilhelm Fell, one of the senior figures on the scene and the first German general to die in Normandy, as recorded in several contemporary accounts, was a human emblem of the day's brutal and personal costs. His death underscored the immediacy of the stakes. The abstract arguments over doctrine had physical consequences for men who stood and fought. At every level, the invasion's success was a composite achievement. It was the valor of soldiers who waded through surf under machine gun fire. It was the daring of airborne troops who landed in the dark to sow confusion behind enemy lines. It was the meticulous orchestration of logistics that kept landing craft moving for hours. It was the science and the gamble of weather forecasting, which found the narrow window necessary for the operation to proceed. And it was the meticulous art of deception, false armies, convincing radio traffic, and the human intelligence network that kept German attention elsewhere. These elements combined to produce a tactical and strategic situation that overwhelmed defensive preparations. The immediate aftermath of that single day rippled into weeks. Once the Allies had secured a lodgment and prevented an early decisive counterattack, they could steadily build up forces. Men, tanks, artillery, fuel and supplies flowed across the Channel. Every ship that docked and every road that was repaired increased the invaders' ability to press inland. For the Germans, the problem was not merely the loss of ground, but the strategic reality that any possibility of a rapid eviction had vanished. Time now favored the Allies, who could methodically transform their foothold into a theater base for further operations. There is a lesson in the narrowness of decisive windows. The invasion did not fail because of a lack of bravery on the part of defenders, nor did it succeed through courage alone. It succeeded because of timing, deception, mastery of the weather moment, and the application of air power at the critical hour. Those elements amplified the effects of ground action and turned the tide in a way that doctrinal debates alone could not rectify. When the Panzer reserves were finally allowed to move, many of the options they might have exploited had already been foreclosed. Movement itself had become hazardous. Roads were no longer safe conduits, and the concentrated application of aviation made concentration dangerous. Tactical decisions that might have been decisive in an earlier hour were obsolete by afternoon. In a small, poignant catalogue of irony, some who had urged action early perished in the very engagements they sought to avert. General Erich Marx, who had been among those advocating for immediate movement, was killed. His death a bitter confirmation that foresight, even when validated by events, cannot always be translated into timely action within a rigid command framework. Others who sought compromise were left to reckon with what their caution had cost. These human stories are the undercurrent behind the maps and numbers. Each order, each delay, carried a weight of life and death. As evening fell on June 6th, the landscape of Normandy carried the traces of the day's violence. Beaches, once open to the sky, were pressed with men by the thousand. Burned vehicles and shattered obstacles lined some exits. Where the fighting had been fiercest, medics and burial parties worked through the cold. The operational outcome was clear enough. The Allied lodgment held. The scale of forces ashore, described in some narratives as roughly 156,000 by the close of the day, left German commanders stunned. Contemporary tallies vary. Several accounts note a figure nearer to 133,000 by nightfall, while other reports suggest higher totals. Whatever the precise count, the psychological and strategic impact was undeniable. A substantial and sustainable Allied presence had been established on French soil. This day's story should temper any simplified narrative that credits victory to a single cause or to the heroism of one unit alone. The success at Normandy was a complex mosaic. Air power denied defenders freedom of movement. Deception reframed the defenders' interpretation of events. Weather forecasting supplied a fragile but crucial opening. Logistics translated initial footholds into sustainable supply lines. And human bravery carried the operation through moments when the outcome was unclear. Conversely, command paralysis, rules that demanded distant permission for critical moves, compounded by a fearful reading of possible deception, helped solidify the invasion's success by denying defenders the chance to apply their strengths at the decisive moment. There is a particular cruelty in the way timing works in war. A window opens for a few hours or a few days. Outside that window, even the best-laid plans may wither. On June 6th, the window belonged to the attackers. By forcing difficult choices upon German commanders to act and risk being tricked, or to wait and risk being late, the Allies converted hesitation into an operational advantage. In the end, the invasion's strategic victory owed as much to the precise alignment of meteorology, intelligence deception, and air superiority as to the courage of troops taking the beaches. The human cost lingers beyond the maps and operational summaries. Men and officers, defenders and attackers alike, found themselves bound by decisions that were often made far from the shore, and by factors small as weather readings and as intricate as counterintelligence games. The death of senior officers like General Wilhelm Fell and General Erich Marx, figures who, in different ways, touched the arc of that morning, reminds us that the consequences of strategic choices are sharply personal. For families and communities, a single order's delay could become a lifetime of absence. As the weeks following D-Day unfolded, the foothold on France became a backbone for further Allied operations. Reinforcements arrived, supply chains hardened. The German command faced a growing reality. The beachhead would not simply vanish and would become the staging ground for operations that would eventually push deeply into occupied Europe. What began as a dawn surprise matured into a campaign that reshaped the war's trajectory. Reflecting on that morning, what stands out is how often the decisive elements are invisible in the immediate drama of combat. They are found in a forecaster's chart, in the coded reports of a double agent, in the nervous requirement of high-level authorization, and in the capacity of air forces to make roads unsafe for movement. The roar that rose from the sea at dawn was only the audible sign of a far more intricate process at work. The alignment of planning, deception, timing, and application of force. When German generals looked out from their maps toward the beaches and saw tens of thousands of men, a figure some accounts emphasize as about 156,000, they faced not just an enemy on the sand, but the result of choices and misapprehensions that had been brewing for months. That discovery was less a single shock than the culmination of a campaign designed to make surprise possible. There is no tidy moral to extract beyond the obvious truths of consequence and contingency. War is as much arithmetic, timing, logistics, and control as it is valor. The Normandy landings turned on narrow margins and on the willingness of planners to accept enormous risk for a brief chance. For the defenders, institutional practices and the fog of deception constrained options. For historians and students of strategy, the lesson is enduring. In modern warfare, information, timing, and the denial of mobility can be as decisive as numbers of men. If you found this account compelling, like and share the video and watch the deep dive linked in the description for more on the hour-by-hour decisions and the personalities who shaped that day.